Our subject this evening concerns the authorship of the entire Old Testament. For we had said before, we would deal in a message with the question, who wrote the Old Testament? Now, W.H. Green's view was that there were two categories of people involved in writing the Old Testament. There were the ones with the Donum Propheticum and the ones with the Munus Propheticum. There were those who were prophets officially, while others, such as Daniel, so we're told, were not prophets officially. They were simply inspired men who had the prophetic gift. Now, we have stated perhaps as long ago as a year that our belief was that all of the authors of the Old Testament were in the official role of being a prophet. Now, whether that was their prevailing function was another matter, but they were in the official role of officially being an official prophet. I mean, there's no other type of prophet besides an official prophet, except the false ones, and of course they don't count in studies of who wrote the Bible. So that was our contention of perhaps more than a year ago, before we took our long discontinuation in the series, and we picked up with it here the last couple of months, Biblical Lit. So I wonder if you'll turn over to begin with to the last chapter in the Pentateuch, because we have to ourselves look through the Old Testament, the 39 books of the Old Testament, to see what type of proof we might find to substantiate our claim. That being that all of the authors of the Old Testament were prophets in the official sense of the word. If you want to call them Munus Propheticum, that's okay with me. But they didn't just have the gift, they had the anointed Old Testament and role of being a prophet. Now, this was our contention for all. Now, before we get into this, I dare say that probably a lot of you here, if not all of you here, never thought of it being that way. If you thought of anything, you thought of certain ones being prophets, but maybe someone like Ezra not being a prophet. Well, you would have fallen into Green's category. Because how did Ezra write the book of Ezra if he wasn't a prophet? Well, he was anointed whenever he wrote it. All right, there you're saying the same thing W.H. Green said. There's a difference between just being anointed to write it, which would be the prophetic gift, and being a prophet all the time. Not anointed all the time, but still a prophet all the time. And most people feel that way. When you come to a book like, any of them written by Solomon. What was Solomon? Solomon was a prophet? No, Solomon wasn't a prophet. He was a king. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel were prophets, but not Solomon. And Daniel, you might think, was a prophet. You might not have missed that in W.H. Green's theory, but most people still would have missed the other area. They never would have conceived of the fact that people like Nehemiah and Ezra were really prophets in the Old Testament. Now, we still haven't proven that, and that's what we need to do tonight. Find out what type of proof we have from the Old as well as the New Testament, because at least on a couple of occasions we'll have to go to the New for some proof about the Old Testament authors. On what exactly were these men? And we'll see when we get to, I guess, the conclusion to tonight, if we have time to go that far, that it's very important, according to a New Testament passage, that one recognize that these authors of all of these 39 or 24 or 22 books or 3 divisions or 2 divisions in the Old Testament were all prophets. Now we start here in Deuteronomy 34 and verse 10 in raising the question about the Pentateuch, or the Torah. Now, in OT introduction, we gave many proofs for Mosaic authorship, so we're not going to do that. We're going to all assume that we believe the same thing about who wrote the Pentateuch, that Moses wrote all of it, including Genesis, although there's no reference to him writing Genesis like there is to the other books, especially Deuteronomy. We're going to all believe that we agree on the fact that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, but was Moses a prophet? Now this is going to be very interesting, so you might want to pay attention. Verse 10. Before you read that, you might ask yourself the question, where in the Bible is Moses referred to as being a prophet, if anywhere? Because you see, according to Green, the distinction between those books that made it in the prophets and those books that made it in the writings was not the content of the book, but the official status of the author. You remember, that's what we gave you in the last message. The contents really did not come into play in considering why the books were there. Books were put in the law and in the writings not on the basis of their contents, but on the basis of the authorship, the official status of the person who wrote the book. Now, if that is true, if books are placed there not according to content, but according to the status of the author, then why? Matthew 5:17, Jesus said, "Think not that I came to destroy the law or the prophets." Now, is he making a distinction between the authorship of whoever it was that wrote the law being different from whoever it was that wrote the prophets? According to Green, that would have to be true. And you see, according to Green, what you would end up with is the fact that Moses was not a prophet. Because if it's according to, if it's according to the official status, then why didn't all of the books of Moses make it into the prophets if he was a prophet? That's what I'm saying. Because that's what Green's argument would end up with if you followed it far enough down the road. Then why is his books called the law? The only conclusion is because he's not a prophet. If the books are placed there not on the content basis, but on the authorship basis, then why didn't Moses make it into the prophets? He must not have been a prophet. Verse 10, something to think about. "And there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Now, is it really saying that he's a prophet? Or could it not be saying, there arose not a prophet like Moses? Not that Moses was a prophet, but of all the prophets that came after Moses, none of the prophets were like the man Moses, not necessarily like the prophet Moses. You can very easily end up with that from reading this verse. And rather than have what we've used before as a good proof text for Moses being a prophet, we find out, in fact, he's not a prophet. Because according to this, the prophets that would come after him are distinguished from him, as evidently one being not a prophet. "In all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh and to all his servants and all his land, and in all that mighty hand and in all that great terror which Moses showed in the sight of all Israel." Now, another passage that comes to mind is over in Exodus. I think it's in chapter 7. Exodus 7 and verse 1. Another text to go along with this discussion of Deuteronomy 34 and verse 10. You see what we're saying here? If Green's view is right, that the distinction is made on the basis of authorship, not contents, then why didn't Moses make it into the prophets? Why do we have those 16 times in the New Testament of the references to the Old Testament as being either Moses and the prophets, Moses and the prophets? In other words, Moses is not a prophet, or he would have made it into the prophets. Or the law and the prophets. And again, Moses writing the law, but still not considered to be part of the prophets. That's why it's so important what we'd given you concerning why the distinctions were made, like the prevailing function, like the historical use of the book, like the content of the book, as well as the other things that we gave you. Because here in verse 1, God says to Moses, "See, I have made thee a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet." And so people would end up with the idea that instead of Moses being the prophet that they had been taught, the prophet is Aaron. And what would be Moses? Well, he would be the lawgiver. And that's why these 5 books are called the law. And according to our position, that is why they would be separated, the law from the prophets, because of the prevailing function of the author. The prevailing function, Moses' number one function, is to be a lawgiver. He sets down the laws of Israel. And in addition to that, the content of the material. We have the judicial regulations in the 5 books of Moses, rather than the repentance-type sermons that we have over in the prophets, or the historical portions that we have in the former prophets. But according to them, the distinction is made not on the basis of any of these other considerations that we've given, but simply on the basis of who wrote the book, and therefore Moses could obviously not be a prophet. So have you come up with a passage yet? Where is Moses called a prophet anywhere in the Bible? You could run over to the New Testament, look all through the New Testament, and it always separates him from the prophets by saying Moses and the prophets. And if you're following someone like Green's view, then that sounds very well, and it fits right in with your theory that Moses is not a prophet. Well, we've got the answer to that problem over in Hosea. Now, whenever we have Hosea, we see what Hosea said, then we can go back there to that passage, Deuteronomy 34:10, and see that he's not making a distinction between the prophets and Moses. He's calling Moses a prophet there by saying that there will not another prophet, in other words, is what the implication is. Not another prophet arise after him that'll be like Moses, and therefore Moses would have to be a prophet. But it doesn't say it there as it says it in Hosea 12 and verse 13. So here's really the best text. And by a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt, and by a prophet was he preserved throughout all of the wilderness. Well, Aaron died in the wilderness. Moses lived all the way to the very end, just before they came into the Canaan land where Joshua took over. But Hosea very clearly names Moses as being a prophet of the Lord. Now that's just understood because of the role and ministry that he had. But it's interesting, and it's true that you won't find passages in the Bible that call him Moses the prophet. They'll call him Moses the servant of Yahweh and the man of Elohim. Always the man of Elohim and the servant of Yahweh. The servant of the Lord and the man of God. But it's rare when you'll ever find him referred to as Moses the prophet. And yet it's generally accepted by people, unless you're trying to prove some other theory, that certainly Moses was a prophet. And here Hosea said, by a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt, and by a prophet was he preserved. So evidently Moses must have been a prophet after all. So that answers the question of the Pentateuch. We just thought we'd play around with the subject for a moment because it's done by others by saying Moses really was not a prophet. We'll look at one other passage perhaps later on if we have time to get to it. So we've got, remember, 39 books to go through. That takes care of 5 of them as far as prophets being the authors of Old Testament books. All 5 of the Pentateuch being written by Moses, and Moses being a prophet. Next we just come to the whole category of what we can call the latter prophets. That would be the 3 major and the 12 minor. Now they're obviously prophets, so we're not going to go look in all of their books, but I'm talking about Isaiah, skipping over Daniel for the time being, but Isaiah all the way down to Malachi, in the order of our Bible anyway, not chronologically, but in the order of our Bible. From Isaiah down to Malachi, or from Obadiah down to Malachi. And what you've got is a whole group of latter prophets who are what? Prophets. So there's no sense in looking at them. But we've still got many remaining books. The first of these is the book of Joshua. Believing that Joshua wrote the book of Joshua. Then what about Joshua and his role? Well, we've got a couple of passages. Numbers 27, verses 18 through 23. We'll simply have to piece together the passages that we find in reference to these authors to see if they were considered to be prophets from the Old Testament. I feel that some people's conception of an Old Testament prophet is really not that true. They think of a prophet being someone like Isaiah, who walks around naked and barefoot all the time, or someone like Ezekiel, who does these weird, outlandish things that God requires of him to act out his prophecies. But when it comes to some simple soul like Joshua, he's not prophesying about anything. He is a military commander-in-chief of the forces of Israel as they go into the Promised Land. So now in Numbers 27:18, we have the case of the anointing of Joshua, the impartation of blessing and ministry and spirit to him by Moses. Take thee Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay thine hand upon him. and set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and give him a charge in their sight. This is a very solemn occasion here. And we've really only got one of two choices. Either he's being inducted into the role of a priest or the role of a prophet. I mean, it's a very solemn occasion where he's being given a charge over everyone, and he's going to have some type of official rule among the people. And it can only be one of two things. Not a lawgiver, because we only had one lawgiver, and that's Moses. Either a priest or a prophet. And which of those is true? Well, he certainly wasn't a priest. The only thing left is that he was a prophet. And thou shalt put some of thine honor upon him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. Well, they were to be obedient unto the prophets that led them. And he shall stand before Eleazar the priest. So he's contrasting his role with that of Eleazar. And if Eleazar is a priest, then Joshua would be a prophet. Who shall ask counsel for him after the judgment of Urim before the Lord? At his word shall they go out, and at his word shall they come in, both he and all the children of Israel with him, even all the congregation. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him. And he took Joshua and set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation. And he laid his hands upon him and gave him a charge as the Lord commanded by the hand of Moses. So the implication is that we've got a serious, solemn occasion transpiring here before our eyes, and that is that Joshua is being put into the official position of a prophet in Israel. And then over in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34 and verse 9. There's no sense in giving all of these references here to the anointed divine impartation of ministry and of blessing and of the role of leadership from Moses to Joshua, unless Joshua is assuming the role of an Old Testament prophet. Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. And the children of Israel hearkened unto him, and did as the Lord commanded Moses. And then down in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 5. There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. So that's a fairly big role he's fulfilling, where God promises him, I'll be with you to the same degree that I was with Moses. Not in the manner of revelation, because Numbers 12 says that the prophets that came after Moses would have different types of revelation. They would be communicated, in other words, by different means. But in the sense of him being the anointed leader over Israel, and them successfully following him, and he being successful in what God has called him to do, then God is with him to the same degree that he's with Moses. We just had read there in Deuteronomy 34, verses 10 to 12, that no one has come after him that worked all the signs and wonders. So obviously God's not with Joshua in that sense of the word, as he was with Moses. Although Joshua is commanding the sun to stand still, that's a pretty good miracle. It's not the repetition of miracles that Moses does by bringing plagues upon a whole nation, all of the 10 strokes that he brought upon Egypt. So I think it's safe to assume that Joshua, from these passages, is an Old Testament prophet. Next we come to Judges, book of Judges. Old Testament introduction. By tradition, Samuel was the author of the book of Judges. And so no further proof is needed there, because Samuel was a prophet. So far, so good. We're still in, and by the way, what section are we dealing with in these two books so far, Joshua, Judges? The former prophets. They're known as prophets, whether you're in Josephus or the Talmud or our Bible. They're known as prophets. So, you know, we can't say that they're not prophets and try to base that on someone's discovery or someone's brainstorm they had last century, when it's been this way for hundreds and hundreds of years. Whoever first put the books in that order must have had a good reason for putting Joshua and Judges among the former prophets. And we told you before in Old Testament the reason why is because the authors were prophets. Okay, in the next place we come to Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Now, of course, we hold that Samuel wrote at least some of Samuel. perhaps Jeremiah, Kings. We don't know who else wrote other portions of Samuel. But really, without going into that, we can say the following. You remember in several earlier messages last year on lost books of the Bible, we discussed a whole section of Old Testament books, because they came under that dispensation, a whole section of books there that contained various chronicles and various records about the kings, and all of them were written by this series of prophets, although none of them got into our Bible. So we can ask ourselves the question, are we to assume that these lost books were written by prophets, but then did not make it into our Old Testament, and the books that did, that would have been a parallel to the others, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, were not written by prophets? Well, that wouldn't make any sense at all. So just good logic there shows you that if those books were lost, and we know they were written by prophets, then obviously the books that are not lost but that did make it in would in like manner have been written by prophets. So I think that's enough for Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, as long as you can follow along. The logic is certainly well done. Then we come to the book of Psalms. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Psalms. Now here we have to discuss a variety of authors, because we don't just have one here. So let's begin over in the 90th Psalm. Now you'll find all of these remarks under the Psalms fairly interesting on were the author's prophets. Psalm 90, the heading, a prayer of Moses. And remember, I mentioned just a few moments ago, he's always called either the servant of the Lord or the man of God, the servant of Yahweh or the man of Elohim. And here's where he's called that for one place, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. But according to Hosea 12:13, he's a prophet. So a prophet wrote at least Psalm 90, and the subject matter of the next psalm would connect it with Psalm 90 and would point toward a unity in authorship, that being, of course, Mosaic. Moses, in other words, wrote Psalm 90 as well as Psalm 91. You compare the first few verses of both Psalms, and you can see that the subject matter is the same. Then what about some other authors? Ethan, Heman, and the sons of Korah. You remember that Ethan had a psalm, Heman had a psalm, the sons of Korah had psalms. Well, let's go over to 1 Chronicles 25. Verses 1, 2, and 5. Now you have to remember that much from Old Testament, that Ethan and Heman and sons of Korah all authored their own psalms. 1 Chronicles 25. Moreover, David and the captains of the host separated to the service of the sons of Asaph and of Heman and of Jeduthun. Jeduthun is just another name for Ethan, it appears to be in the Old Testament, who should prophesy with harps, psalteries, with cymbals. The number of the workmen according to their service was, but so far, what did it say? They would prophesy. Of the sons of Asaph, Zachar and Joseph, Nethaniah, Azariah, the sons of Asaph under the hands of Asaph, which prophesied according to the order of the kings. And then, particularly verse 5, and the sons of Korah are not going to be any different than the sons of Asaph. That's the point. Verse 5, all these were the sons of Heman, the king's seer, in the words of God, to lift up the horn. Well, seer is an Old Testament term for an Old Testament prophet. And it calls Heman here the king's seer, or the king's prophet. So obviously this group of individuals must be prophets. What about Asaph himself? We know that Asaph wrote 12 psalms. We're still on the book of Psalms now. Asaph wrote 12 psalms. Well, look over in 2 Chronicles 29 and verse 30. Because here we have a fairly large segment, 12 whole psalms, attributed to this one man, Asaph. So far, all these men that we've been looking at that wrote Old Testament books are all prophets. 2 Chronicles 29:30. Moreover, Hezekiah the king and the princes commanded the Levites to sing praise unto the Lord with the words of David and of Asaph the seer. They sang praises with gladness, and they bowed their heads in worship. Well, 1 Samuel 9:9 tells us that a seer is the same thing as a prophet. And so now Heman has been called a seer, and now Asaph, who wrote 12 Psalms, is called a seer. 1 Samuel 9:9 says he's a prophet. So there are all those Psalms that were written by Asaph, the sons of Korah, Ethan, and Heman were all prophets then, as well as Moses, who wrote his. Then over in Matthew chapter 13, here's one of those interesting New Testament references that most people would read right over and would assume, falsely so, that he had reference to one of the well-known major or minor prophets. Matthew 13, verses 34 and 35. That's why we study, so we can all be scholars of the Bible. Hallelujah. All these things spake Jesus unto the multitude in parables, and without a parable spake he not unto them. Well, why did he do something as strange and self-defeating as that? That it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying. Now, if you read right over that, you'd think, okay, he's going to quote Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, one of the prophets. And he quotes one of the Psalms. I will open my mouth in parables, and I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. Well, let's see. What's the reference? Psalm 78. Well, you might want to go back to Psalm 78 and just check and see who wrote Psalm 78. Because he says that this is spoken by the prophet. And if you know anything about the New Testament, well, we could take Matthew. Before we look at that passage, you can stay with the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 2. In 4 different places, 4 places just in one chapter, Matthew 2, Matthew is saying, such and such was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. One time he refers to Micah, one time is Hosea, one time is Jeremiah, and so forth. Those are the well-known prophets there, whether major or minor. And it says, this was done that it might be fulfilled that was spoken by the prophet. And so when we get here to Matthew 13, he's saying it in the same way as though there's no distinction between whoever this prophet is and one of those well-known accepted prophets like Jeremiah, Hosea, or Micah. And who is that prophet? Look in Psalm 78. Asaph. Asaph. People read right over that in Matthew 13, think he's referring to one of what they would say the prophets. Well, he is one of the prophets, but not who you think is a prophet, but Asaph, because everyone who wrote a book in the Old Testament was a prophet. So Matthew 13, 34 and 35 is a good 2 verses to remember, because it uses that frequent phrase that we see in the New Testament, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, and yet refers to someone that the typical Christian wouldn't conceive of as really being a prophet. Or at least if he was, it would be like Green says, well, he had the prophetic gift and not the prophetic office. He's somehow less of a prophet than Jeremiah, where Matthew is saying it in the same way as he does when he talks about Micah or when he talks about Hosea. Well, let's look at one of those passages before we go on. They're in Matthew 2. Matthew 2 and verse 5. They said unto him, where is the king going to be born, Messiah? In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. He's talking about Micah there. Then verse 15. And was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet. Quoting a passage from Hosea, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. And then when you come to Matthew 13:35, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. So Asaph must have been a prophet to the same degree, and in the same manner, and with the same role and office as Hosea, Micah, and all of the others. It's just that he had the added blessing of playing musical instruments along with his prophecies, whereas we don't find Micah playing an instrument. Not that he didn't. He may well have. A lot of them did. But at least we know that these Asaph, Ethan, Heman, the sons of Korah, and so forth, played musical instruments. Now that takes us through a large number of Psalms, but we haven't gotten to the most important author of the Psalms, and who would that be? David. Well, we can go over to Acts chapter 2 and verse 30. Now David wrote almost half of the Psalms. So now if we can prove he's a prophet, that's going to be a big plus in our favor. Verse 25 with verse 30 of Acts 2, where he starts quoting some of what David said. For David speaketh concerning him, and I think this is from the 16th Psalm. He begins quoting some from the end of Psalm 16. So that's from verse 25 through, let's see, verse 28. Men and brethren, let me freely speak unto you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us unto this day. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him, and so forth. Therefore, being a prophet. Now, we didn't cover this passage because I wanted to save it for tonight last week, but Green says the same thing about David that he does about Daniel. That, oh, he wasn't really a prophet, he simply had the prophetic gift, the donum propheticum.
For the continuation of this
tonight, last week, but Green says the same thing about David that he does about Daniel. That, oh, he wasn't really a prophet, he simply had the prophetic gift, the donum propheticum. But we already saw about Daniel in Matthew 24, he's called a prophet. And here, according to verse 30 of Acts 2, in the same manner, King David, nevertheless, was still an Old Testament prophet. You see, they think a prophet's got to be a fellow with a beard or something, goes around mumbling things under his breath. That if you're David in your palace and you're eating your grapes and having harps played around you and you inventing some of those instruments yourself, that you somehow couldn't be a prophet. That's a misconception of prophetism in the Old Testament. All of these fellows are prophets. If the important person in the Old Testament's not a prophet, then he's probably a priest, because you really only have those two. You're either a prophet or a priest. Now, of course, you've got some kings, but right away, here's a King David who also was a prophet at the same time. It's just that his role as a king is generally more well known than his role as a prophet. And they think that if he did anything, he wrote songs for us to sing. And that's right, the book of Psalms. But they were inspired of the Spirit because he was a prophet. And it was a prophet writing those.
Hallelujah.
And so Green wants to explain this passage away. Just like Matthew 24 and Daniel, now we've got Acts 2:30 and David saying, no, he couldn't have really been a prophet. Nowhere in the Old Testament does it say he's a prophet. A passage comes to mind where it does say that he's a prophet, or it says something that it only uses in reference to prophets. I have to find where that is. I think that's in 2 Samuel 23.
Hallelujah.
2 Samuel 23, verses 1 and 2. Now these be the last words of David. Now we're going to read through these couple of verses, but what's said here, especially in verse 2, is only said of a prophet. David the son of Jesse said, who of course is the king, and the man who was raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel, said, the Spirit of the Lord spake by me, and his word was in my tongue. He's claiming divine authority and divine inspiration in what he says, and that is only said in reference to a prophet in the Old Testament. So there is a good passage in the Old Testament, without going to Acts 2:30, referring to the fact that David is certainly an Old Testament prophet. Okay, let's come to the writings of Solomon. That took care of just about all the Psalms. Now Solomon wrote Psalm 72 and Psalm 127, so we'll just kind of include those in with Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and the Song of Solomon. Psalm 72 and Psalm 127. All of these would be the writings of Solomon. So we've got two Psalms. We've got Ecclesiastes. We've got Proverbs. Now, both of those would seem to come from perhaps just a sagacious type of individual. Then we've got the Song of Solomon. That's from a romantic individual. So could the author of this, Solomon, really have been a prophet? Well, go to 1 Kings 3, and then I don't think we need to turn, but 1 Kings 9. Now, on two occasions in Solomon's life, we're told that God appeared to him personally by means of a dream and spoke something to him. 1 Kings 3 and verse 5. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give thee." And then over in 1 Kings 9, verses 1 to 2. The Lord appeared to Solomon the second time as he appeared unto him at Gibeon, the passage we just read in 1 Kings 3 and verse 5. So the point to begin with is that on two occasions, God appeared to Solomon to give him revelation of the future, told him what he was going to do in his life, and to give him understanding of things. Now, with that in mind, go over to Numbers chapter 12 and verse 6. You see, you have to know your Old Testament to know how you can prove these things. And even if you couldn't do all the proving that we're doing now, it ought to be generally accepted that the authors were prophets from some clear passages in the New Testament. Numbers 12:6. Hear now my words, if there be a prophet among you. I'll tell you how to recognize him. I, the Lord, will make myself known unto him in a vision and will speak to him in a dream. Well, he spoke to Solomon twice in a dream. And God says that's how you'll know that he's a prophet. So great romantic, many wives, King Solomon must have also been an Old Testament prophet. Maybe not the best Old Testament prophet, but he was still an Old Testament prophet, according to Numbers chapter 12 and verse 6. So that takes care of all the writings of Solomon. Anything Solomon wrote was written by a prophet. Okay, in the next place, that doesn't finish out Proverbs. Why? Because Solomon wasn't the sole author of Proverbs. We've got some wise men who would fit in the same category as Agur and who would fit in the same category as Lemuel. Agur of 30 in verse 1 and Lemuel of 31 in verse 1. So that took care of a large section of the book of Proverbs, but we have other authors that contributed some of the writings in Proverbs. So go over to chapter 30 and verse 1. Now Solomon was certainly a wise man. As a matter of fact, we're told that he was the wisest man, and he was a prophet. And one group of authors for some of these proverbs were called the wise men. You remember that from Old Testament introduction? They were called the wise men. So if Solomon's a wise man and he's a prophet, then these wise men, plural, were also prophets who wrote some in Proverbs. But then we have Agur, the words of Agur, the son of Jacob, even the prophecy. Well, prophets were the ones that prophesied in the Old Testament. There wasn't the distinction between the simple gift and the ministry, like there is over in the New Testament. So here, Agur has a prophecy. So Agur must have been a prophet. Then in chapter 31 and verse 1, Lemuel. Now whether Lemuel is actually the author of all of this, or some of it, or whether he's simply repeating this prophecy that was taught to him by his mother, in either case it's still called a prophecy. It doesn't matter whether Lemuel wrote all of this, or maybe wrote part of it. It doesn't matter. Because whoever wrote it, it's still called a prophecy in Proverbs 31 and verse 1. So it must have been written by a prophet. So that takes care of all of the book of Proverbs. All of the Proverbs were written by Old Testament prophets. Next we come to Ruth and Lamentations. Now both of these books were formally attached to prophetic books. Ruth to Judges, Lamentations to Jeremiah, so that answers their question. Obviously both of them were as well written by prophets. Then we come to Daniel. Matthew 24:15, Jesus calls Daniel the prophet. That takes care of the book of Daniel. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Now we've got another interesting proof on Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Now the prevailing functions of the authors were scribe and governor, respectively. Ezra, Chronicles was written by Ezra, Nehemiah. And so we have on the first place a scribe, and in the second place a governor. The scribe being Ezra, the governor being Nehemiah. So according to Green, there's all the proof he needs, because they're actually called that in their books. Ezra the scribe and Nehemiah the Tirshatha, or the governor. So could they really be prophets? Well, turn over to Jeremiah 27:18. According to their books, we see a great public anguish manifested by them over sin, which according to Jeremiah 27:18 puts them in the ministry of a prophet. And I will look at those passages in just a moment in their books. Great public anguish over sin in their lives, according to Jeremiah 27:18, clearly puts them in the role of a prophet. He's arguing against some of the false prophets, and Jeremiah says, if they be prophets, and if the word of the Lord be with them, 2 Samuel 23:2, David claimed that the word of the Lord was with him, which was simply synonymous with claiming to be a prophet. If they be prophets, and if the word of the Lord be with them, then let them now make intercession to the Lord of hosts, that the vessels which are left in the house of the Lord, and in the house of the king of Judah, and at Jerusalem, go not to Babylon. In other words, cry out to the Lord on behalf of his people, rather than standing up and just talking and prophesying these things all the time. So Jeremiah is saying, a condition, if you want to be a prophet, if they be prophets, then let's see some of that public anguish and lamenting over sin that I've done, and that all of the true prophets which came before me have done whenever they have seen the people of God sin. Okay, with that in mind, over to Ezra chapter 9 and verse 1, really all the way through chapter 10 and verse 1. This is the story of the evil report that's been brought back to Ezra on what's been going on. We'll just skip along here because we don't have time to read, of course, that whole chapter. Ezra 9:1, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands. They've taken daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of those lands. Yea, the hand of the princes and rulers hath been chief in this trespass. And when I heard this thing, then I rent my garment and my robe, and plucked off the hair of my head and of my beard, and sat down astonished. Verse 5, I fell upon my knees, and spread out my hands unto the Lord my God, and said, O my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift up my face to thee, my God. For our iniquities are increased over our head, and our trespass is grown up unto the heavens. Chapter 10, verse 1, Now when Ezra had prayed, and when he had confessed, weeping and casting himself down before the house of God. So what's he doing here? Public outcry and lamentations and anguish over sin. And according to Jeremiah 27:18, that's what a true prophet is going to do. So that would tell us that Ezra is a prophet. Then Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 4 through 11. He's just heard from a brother of his, a kinsman of his, that the gates of Jerusalem have been burned and the wall broken down. And it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned certain days and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Verse 6, to confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against thee. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We have dealt very corruptly against thee, and so forth. What is he doing? He's again interceding on behalf of the people of God. False prophets wouldn't do that. Someone who's just a scribe, whose function is to nothing but write things down, or someone who's just a governor who is only a political leader, so everyone would tell us, would not be required to do anything like this. It must be a prophet that is coming forth in their life at this time, their ministry of a prophet that causes them to do these things. Now, whenever Nehemiah gets over there, like in chapter 2, he goes over there on his first expedition to see what really is going to take place, then he does take political charge. And he's the one who rations things out and makes sure that the city gets built and the walls get built and so forth. So there's his prevailing function. But here in his very first chapter, we see him not as a governor. He doesn't appear as a governor here. He appears as an Old Testament prophet. According to Jeremiah 27:18, weeping and confessing and interceding. Interceding. That's what Jeremiah says. He'll make intercession to God for the people. Interceding on behalf of the people. So, that takes care of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. The only book in all of the Old Testament that's left is Esther. And it's about this book that we have the least amount of information. What we can say really are two things. In the first place, every other book in the Old Testament, as we just have proven, was written by a prophet. So I think we're safe to assume that Esther was written by a prophet as well. Every other book has been. Now, if you went William Henry Green's way and you couldn't prove that every book had been written by a prophet, then of course you're not going to include Esther as being one of the prophets. And in the second place, the outlook on the Jews' great deliverance is certainly that of a prophet. It's just the outlook of a prophet in the way the book is written and the material that it contains. Now that finishes up all 39 Old Testament books, and all of them were written by prophets. So there's proof just from, for the most part, the Old Testament, with one or two references over to the New, that all of these men who wrote these books were all prophets. Now, in conclusion, I want to give you several conclusions. That's what you do when you conclude, is give conclusions. So a couple of conclusions on the basis of what we've just been looking at. They'll kind of sum up all that we've said before and finish out authorship of the Old Testament. In the first place, just like the term law in John 10:34 is used to sum up all of the Old Testament, then so is the term prophets, used in the New Testament to sum up all of the Old Testament. Now we're going to look at maybe a passage we haven't looked at before. Over in Matthew 26. Remember in John 10:34, the term law is used to refer to all of the Old Testament. In the same way, just the singular term prophets is used to refer to all of the Old Testament. Now this is at Jesus' arrest. He asked her, "You come out against a thief with these swords. I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple. You laid no hold on me." Matthew 26:56. But all of this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Well, obviously, he's talking about the scriptures, and the scriptures are all 39 books of the Old Testament, not just those that we would count, or even just that Josephus would count as being among the prophets, the 5:13-4 division. He's talking about the scriptures. What were the scriptures? Matthew's gospel, of course, wasn't written at this time when he's saying this. The only scriptures are all of the Old Testament. And he calls those scriptures the scriptures of the prophets. In other words, the scriptures that were authored by the prophets, which would mean that all of the Old Testament authors were all prophets. That gives a strange cross-reference. I don't know if your version does to Lamentations 4, but that ought to be marked out. Lamentations 4 has nothing to do with that. Zechariah 13:7 is a better cross-reference. But he says all of the scriptures of the prophets. So Zechariah 13:7 is just one, that the disciples forsook him and fled. But that was only one thing that was prophesied. He's talking about all that's taken place in his life was already prophesied by the scriptures of the prophets, the Old Testament writings. But then over in Acts chapter 10 and verse 43, very similar to Matthew 26:56. To him give all the prophets witness that through faith in his name whosoever believeth in him shall receive remission of sins. Now Peter's preaching to Cornelius, and he says to Jesus Christ, give all of the prophets witness. Now, if Moses is not a prophet, then what he'd be saying here is Moses does not give any type of witness to Christ. But I wonder if you'll turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 18. This is the other passage that I mentioned earlier this evening that would point to the fact that Moses is no doubt a prophet. Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15, which is quoted by Peter in Acts chapter 3. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. So if Jesus is a prophet, then so is Moses a prophet. And unto him ye shall hearken. So what we're saying is there in Acts 10:43, where Peter is preaching, and he says that to him give all the prophets witness, he's not just talking about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. He's talking about all of the authors of the Old Testament, including people like David. David and Asaph and the writers of the Psalms are chiefly giving witness to Jesus in the writings of the book of Psalms. So he would certainly be including them. And he's including Moses, according here to Deuteronomy 18:15, because Moses gave witness to him. So the term prophets refers to all of these writings. Then a second conclusion. Josephus 5:13-4 set up, where all of the Old Testament books outside of the law are put in his section known as the prophets, with the exception of the writings of David and Solomon, is very interesting, because he, of all the books, even includes the book of Esther among the prophets. And remember, he came 300 years before the Talmud. So his 5:13-4 setup, we intimated last week that there must be something unique about that, and there is. His 5:13-4 setup tells us that at least even if we leave out some of the writings of David or some of the writings of Solomon, and he said that was not because they weren't prophets, but because they contained hymns to God and precepts for right conduct and right living. Even if we leave those out, he's putting Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, Esther, all of those books among the prophets. And what makes that more interesting than anything is when you know something about Josephus, that after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, at the hands of Titus, the Roman general who became the Roman emperor, Josephus became personal friends with Titus because someone had prophesied that Titus would actually take over Palestine. And whenever Titus took Jerusalem, he took all of the gold and silver out of the temple of the Lord, and he gave to Josephus all of the official sacred Hebrew scrolls. Josephus was the one that came into possession of all of that. Now, his division then must have been based upon some official type of division that was in the temple in Jerusalem at least as early as AD 70. He doesn't write for a couple of decades after that, when we've given you his quotations before. But it's interesting that he was the one that gained possession of all of these official Hebrew rolls, and evidently he found in there that Esther was written by a prophet, and that's why he puts Esther back there. And he's not, as I said earlier, putting Psalms and the writings of Solomon outside of that division because the authors weren't prophets, but because of the material contained. And then I have another quote to give you from his book Against Appian, the paragraph just before one we've given you earlier. In the first book, in the 7th paragraph, a sentence quote. Josephus said, every one is not permitted to, of his own accord, be a writer, nor is there any disagreement in what is written, they being only prophets that have written the original and earliest accounts of things as they learned them of God himself by inspiration. and others, speaking of those besides the Old Testament writers, have written what hath happened in their own times, and that in a very distinct manner also. Well, he says right in the middle of this quote that they, being only prophets, wrote the Old Testament. So it was his belief that even though he took 4 books and put them among the writings or the hymns in the precepts section, even though he took 4 and put them there, he still considered the authors of those books to be prophets, because he said that someone of their own accord was not allowed to write an Old Testament book. Only if you were a prophet were you allowed to write. And just because you were a prophet doesn't mean you could write. But at least you had to be a prophet. That was one qualification before any of your books or any of your writings would be accepted into this Old Testament official Jewish canon. So that's an interesting quote from Josephus. Then in the final place, we've got 2 crucial New Testament passages. Hebrews 1 and verse 1, which we'll quickly read and close up. Hebrews 1 and verse 1, 2 Peter 1, 20 to 21. Hebrews 1:1, God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets. He's referring to all of that chain of revelation in the Old Testament era. And he says God spake by means of the prophets, so they would all be prophets. And then more importantly than that, 2 Peter 1, verses 20 and 21. Knowing this first, that no prophecy of the Scripture is of any private interpretation. For the prophecy came not in old time by the will of man, but holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. Now it calls it prophecy here. It doesn't call the authors prophets yet. It just calls them holy men of God. All right, let's go to a couple of Old Testament passages. 1 Kings 13:1. And you'll see that particular phrase, man of God, was an Old Testament phrase carried over into the New in reference to a prophet. 1 Kings 13:1, and behold, there came a man of God out of Judah. This was the young prophet deceived by the older one that was killed by the lion. And what does it call him? A prophet? No, it calls him a man of God, because that was an accepted designation for an Old Testament prophet to call him a man of God. That's why Moses in Psalm 90, the heading there was called a prayer of Moses, the man of God, or the man of Elohim. Because if you're a man of God, you're a prophet. Then in chapter 17 and verse 24, the woman said to Elijah, now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in thy mouth is true. I know you're a prophet now because, of course, he raised her son from the dead. Then 2 Kings 1, 9 to 10. This is interesting. Then the king sent unto him Elijah, a captain of 50 with his 50. And they came and said to him, thou man of God, come down. What does Elijah say? Verse 10, 2 Kings 1. If I be a man of God, then let fire come down from heaven and consume thee and thy 50. If I be a man of God. And of course we know Elijah to be great Elijah the Tishbite, the hairy prophet. So we know he's a prophet. But yet they're always referring to him here as a man of God. And then in chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, speaking of Elisha. And it fell on a day that Elisha passed to Shunem, where there was a great woman. And he went by there often, and so she constrained him to come in. And she said unto her husband, behold now, I perceive that this is a holy man of God. What did 2 Peter 1 say? Holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. So just because it doesn't say prophets spake doesn't mean they weren't prophets. When it says holy men of God, here according to 2 Kings 4:9, a prophet was considered to be a holy man of God. So 2 Peter 1, 20 to 21 is a classic passage that says all of the Old Testament was written by holy men of God, and if you're a holy man of God, then you were considered to be an Old Testament prophet. Which we didn't even have to go to all the trouble we went to an hour before this and showing you all those other passages. All you need is that one to show you that all of the Old Testament was written by prophets, including Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, Judges, Joshua. All of it was written by a prophet. If they were holy men of God, they were prophets, and the prophets, the holy men of God, wrote the Old Testament.
For a complete list of brothers